Chapter 9. I toss and I turn. Screams ripped from Vittorio Cataldi's throat as if his very grief was trying to kill him.
This is all my fault. I should have been the one to fight. Kocaqi wouldn't have died if I had.
He bit down on his lips hard, cutting through them. Blood spattered down his chin. The room he was in was a sight to behold. There were bite marks all over the walls. Even now, a fresh bite mark was gnawing its way into the wall. Vittorio's knife hung from his hip, its naked blade reflecting the wall, transferring 70% of the damage he was inflicting. Vittorio began beating his head against the wall. Dents began appearing in a totally different one. The walls were much harder than his skull. Any of these blows was hard enough to kill him instantly were it not for his stand. He was flinging himself against the wall with all his strength, no considerations for his own safety. Perhaps his lack of self-control had led the part of his mind interested in self-preservation to give birth to a stand that transferred damage. Or perhaps years spent under the stand's protection had caused his recklessness. Nobody knew for sure, and it had never occurred to him to wonder. 30% of the damage was done to him, so his head was covered in blood, but this did not discourage him. Angelica was in the corner, sobbing. Vittorio had tried to comfort her several times, but to no avail. Each failure led to more self-harm. The door opened slowly, and Massimo Volpe drifted in. Neither of the others looked at him. They were too absorbed in their own grief. Volpe said nothing. He walked to the center of the room and collapsed. There was a long silence, broken only by sniffling and the rhythmic thudding of head against wall. At last, the latter sound stopped.
Got no choice now,
Vittorio said.
Gotta go after that thing. Like Kocaqi said.
But that, Volpe said,
he called that a last resort. We don't even know what it will do. We got any other ideas? They beat Kocaqi. I don't even know if I could take someone like that down with me. We need to throw everything we got at them. Think it will work? Well, even Kocaqi seemed pretty dubious.
The reason Kocaqi had decided to take the fight to Sicily wasn't just because it was his home and he knew the lay of the land, or because Passione's influence wasn't as strong. There was one other reason, a certain research project that dated back to the Nazi occupation. The Nazis were scouring the world, looking for something many an ancient emperor dreamed of, and although the bulk of their attention was centered on Rome, there was one team in Sicily as well, searching for eternal life. The Nazis dreamed of a powerful army of troops that could not be killed. Though they poured inestimable resources into the search, the man in charge, an SS colonel named Rudolf von Stroheim, was killed in Stalingrad, and the Allied forces reclaimed Sicily before the Nazis' discovery could be removed. It lay buried here to this day. Exactly what was found, nobody knows. The only salvageable evidence were instructions on the use of it. Blood is life. Remembering this, Volpe found himself shivering.
Invincible, undying warriors. That's the only way we can win!
Vittorio sounded desperate. Volpe's eyes went grim.
And we needed to avenge Kocaqi,
he muttered. Suddenly, Angelica let out a particularly loud sob. Staring at nothing, fury on her face, she roared.
They must pay! They must pay!
Vittorio nodded.
We got to do this. It's the only thing we can do.
He jumped to his feet and ran out of the room. Angelica wafted after him. Alone in the room, Volpe sat for a moment, then rose to his feet and followed them out, leaving behind an empty horror. Every corner of the room was covered in human blood. Chunks of flesh stuck to every surface, broken bones jammed into the walls, stuck where they'd been flung. A solitary chin dangled from the ceiling, the remains of 20 men destroyed beyond recognition, the pieces scattered across the room. This was the work of Massimo Volpe's stand gone berserk. As he picked his way through the carnage, he muttered something under his breath.
But what exactly is this stone mask? This is gross, Marolo said, stepping into the blood-stained room.
What the hell?
Ch.9 said, scowling.
These are locals, Sicilian gangsters, not involved with Passione. Friends of Kokaki's. When he died, they decided it wasn't worth it to hide Volpe and his team, turned on them, got wiped out themselves.
They do this to people who'd been their allies a moment before?
Fugo asked. He was more puzzled than horrified.
If they turned on them, they could have just run for it. They could have got away easily. There's no reason to massacre them. Cruelty like this is usually intended as a message for those who find it, but this is beyond that. There's a break here, a decisive one.
Ch.9 gave him a look.
They were never allies,
she said sullenly.
Huh? There was no trust, no give and take. They had no partners, no structures. The narcotics team never worked for anyone but each other.
She looked around at the corpses dispassionately. Fugo almost asked if she was describing herself as well, but decided against it. He felt like her attitude had changed recently. At first, she'd spent a lot of time glaring at him, but now she seemed to be doing her best not to make eye contact. Perhaps because he'd strangled her during the fight against Kocaqi.
But I had no idea if she was under his control or not. I had no choice, but I can see how she'd hold a grudge.
Fugo's mood was increasingly gloomy. He felt backed into a corner with no way out. But Marolo, oblivious to the tension between them, announced cheerily,
"We won't even have to look for them. They'll head straight to their destination, leaving a mountain of corpses in their wake, heedless to the consequences, telling us exactly where they're going."
He snorted and left the room. A minute later, they heard him clapping. He was using his stand. Fugo and Ch.9 followed him in, arriving just as the card tower collapsed.
Ortigia. They're following the coast of Sicily, down to Syracuse.
Ortigia's an island in the center of Syracuse, right?
Ch.9 said, dubious.
But there's nothing there but ruins and historical landmarks. What are they doing in a place like that?
We can ask that once we catch them, if they survive it,
Marolo said, whipping out his phone. He dialed quickly, then spoke to someone on the other end.
"It's me. Yeah, bring it on by. They're headed for Syracuse. Make sure it has enough fuel."
Fuel?
Ch.9 asked.
What did you just call for?
"A helicopter, of course,"
Marolo said, putting his phone away.
"It'll fly us to Syracuse, get us there before they arrive. We'll be waiting for them this time."
Fugo frowned. He'd almost ridden a helicopter once. Narancia had found it.
It's a helicopter key! If we use that, they'll never catch us! Oh, we can go anywhere!
They'd never used the helicopter, but if they had, Fugo wondered if Narancia would have been every bit as excited as he'd been on the yacht. Or would the gravity of their mission have prevented that?
He was never one to stress about things. Always the first to break the tension. Just couldn't concentrate, I guess. Too easygoing by nature.
Had that killed him in the end? Fugo grit his teeth. He had no idea what had happened to him. No way of knowing. He hadn't gone with them. That's why he was here. Trish Una. Diavolo's daughter, raised in ignorance of that fact, sent to meet her father after her mother's death, only to find he planned to kill her. The girl's very life a tragedy. But Fugo still felt no sympathy for her. He'd spent only 2 days with her, but she'd spent the entire time stone-faced, betraying no trace of what she was thinking. When she did open her mouth, it was to demand they do her shopping, risk themselves to purchase things that seemed hardly necessary, or demand one of them take off their shirt to replace her handkerchief. It was difficult to feel protective of her. Fugo despised his own mother and hardly had a high opinion of women in general. He especially hated high-strung women, which Trish clearly was. Why risk everything for her? To this day, he could not understand Bucciolati's decision.
Returning with Trish means that I have now betrayed the boss. He only had us guard her so that he could kill her with his own hand, because as his blood relative, she knew his true identity. When I learned this, I couldn't look the other way. I couldn't go home and wash my hands of the whole business. I've chosen to turn traitor. It was dawn. The world was quiet. The air was crisp.
Fugo couldn't believe what he was hearing, but it was the truth. Trish lay in front of them, bleeding. Everything they'd been told was a lie.
Have you lost your mind, Bucciolati?
Mr. said, equally stunned. You know what happens to traitors, Abbacchio said. You better than most. The boss won't let us get away. He frowned. Abbacchio himself had been responsible for dispatching traitors. They'd just taken out the assassination team for that very reason. The boss's guards will have Venice surrounded by now.
Bucciolati was unmoved. Behind him, Giorno was equally impassive.
I need help, Bucciolati said.
If any of you would come with me, come down the stairs and step onto the boat.
He pointed at the tiny boat floating on the canal behind him. Trish was already on board, bleeding from the wrist. But I won't order you to come with me. I won't even wish for it. This was my decision.
You need feel no obligation towards me. I will say only this. I did what I felt was right. I have no regrets. The world being what it is, all I can do is follow my beliefs. For now, all I can do is run. But everyone has a weakness. We will beat the boss someday. We will find his weakness.
Faced with the strength of Bucciolati's belief and the force behind his words, Fugo felt nothing but confusion. He had no idea what Bucciolati meant by right. That was a belief he had never once encountered at any point in his life. It was like his entire world had been snatched away from him, left without direction, without goals, without anything to base his actions on. Nothing in which he could find purchase. He had placed his faith in Bucciolati. He knew Bucciolati's decisions were usually correct and believed that what was good for Bucciolati was good for him. But that was no longer true. When Bucciolati had scouted Fugo, he told him he had no shot at rehabilitation, yet here Bucciolati was, holding up a groundless, foolish moral choice as if it was worth fighting for, even though that fight would surely lead to his destruction. Abbacchio sat down heavily. Mr. looked away, staring into the distance. Narancia was shaking, trembling in his boots. Was nobody going to say anything? Were none of them going to do anything? Was there nothing to be done to fix this mess? Fugo grit his teeth and forced himself to speak.
I understand what you're saying, Bucciolati. What you're doing is the right thing to do.
Fugo wasn't the least bit convinced by anything Bucciolati had said, but he'd said it to be diplomatic. That wouldn't work though. He had to be clear.
But, let me put it straight. I'm afraid none of us will get on that boat. You've let your emotions cloud your judgment. We all owe you, but we are not boarding that boat. You aren't looking at reality. You can't survive on ideals alone. We can't live outside the mob.
He took a pointed step back. At the time, Fugo still thought there was a chance he could salvage the situation, a faint hope that Bucciolati would change his mind, that they would save him by turning Trish over to the boss. He desperately wanted to believe this. He hoped his words would make him rethink things. Fugo's right, Bucciolati, Abbacchio said. What you're doing is suicide. No matter where you run, no place will be safe.
Yes, Fugo thought. Keep talking like this. Maybe he'll change his mind. We all trust each other. That trust has to count for something. We can't just drop all that.
Abbacchio continued. I swore loyalty to Passione, not to you. However, he stood up. I was a man with no place to go, cast out of society and the country. The only time I feel at peace is when I'm with you, Bucciolati.
Without wasting another moment, he stepped onto the boat and sat down. What? Abbacchio!
Fugo could not believe it. What was he thinking? Here Fugo was, doing his best to fix things, and Abbacchio just ignored his entire argument. If we beat the boss, Mr. said, that makes me the next capo, right? He hopped on board the boat too, like it wasn't a big deal at all. Fugo could feel the rage building. How stupid could they be?
You've all lost your minds. There'll be no one to help you. Where will you even go? You'll never even make it out of Venice!
His voice was a shriek, but none of them even glanced his way. Giorno, by far the calmest person there, spoke quietly. Narancia, he said, what will you do? Fugo jumped. He turned and looked at Narancia. Narancia was a mess, twitching like a lost child, his mouth flapping wordlessly. He looked at Bucciolati for help.
What should I do? Bucciolati, I don't know what to do. Should I come with you?
Are you scared? Bucciolati said. Narancia nodded.
Yeah, terrified.
A shiver ran over him, his voice squeaked.
If you tell me, if you order me to come with you, then I'll find the courage. I'm not scared of anything you order me to do.
No, Bucciolati said fiercely. I can't order this. You have to decide. Decide your own path.
I don't know. I don't know what to do.
But I will give you some advice, Narancia. Don't come. This path isn't for you. Narancia clutched his head in both hands. Bucciolati turned and began casting off. We're leaving! Once his boat leaves, you'll all be traitors! Fugo was overwhelmed with helplessness. Misery gnawed at him. Why hadn't Bucciolati seen reason? It was infuriating.
Why? Are you insane? What's wrong with you? We met her 2 days ago. We've barely talked to the girl. We don't know her. We don't even know what kind of music Trish likes.
His voice was a wail, the cries of a sore loser. Nothing he could say would change things, but he couldn't stop himself from ranting. He glared after the boat until a feeble voice behind him spoke.
Trish was abandoned by someone she trusted,
Narancia whispered. Fugo could barely hear him, but was too pissed off to care.
Whatever. She's his daughter. He can do what he wants. He has his reasons, I'm sure. It's got nothing to do with us. All we had to do was close our eyes. I don't see why that's so damn hard.
While he ranted, Narancia was muttering under his breath.
I was abandoned too. My father, my friends, they all abandoned me. We're the same. Trish and me were alike.
Fugo turned and stared at him, but Narancia was already moving. As Fugo turned towards him, he brushed past Fugo, diving into the canal. He started swimming after the boat. Fugo stared after him blankly, unable to react at all. Narancia was never a great swimmer and was barely keeping himself afloat.
Bucciolati!
He yelled.
I'm coming with you! Wait for me!
As his voice faded into the distance, Fugo stood rooted to the spot. All he could do was watch. Watch Narancia struggle, listen to his cries.
Don't tell me not to come! Trish is B. She's the same as B. The wounds on her arm were my wounds!
The boat stopped to pick him up. Then they were gone. He never once looked back at Fugo, none of them did. And like that, he was all alone. The anger had left him completely. It took him a while to notice. He wasn't upset at the betrayal, nor relieved to be alive. His heart was empty, devoid of all feelings. He was abandoned. But by what? Wasn't he the one who'd abandoned them? So why did he feel like he'd been abandoned? He stood perfectly still as the sun rose higher in the sky and the world grew bright around him. He could feel his skin starting to burn in the sun. It was painful. Everything hurt. It hurt, but what it was, Fugo didn't know. Why? He thought. Why wasn't he angry? None of what had happened was logical, none of it made sense, so why hadn't he lost his temper? Why wasn't he breaking everything in sight? He couldn't figure it out. The helicopter was flying over the Ionian Sea, along the coast where the Megara Hiblea lies. Watching the land race by them, Fugo wondered why Narancia had said those words. Trish is me. What could that mean? A mere expression of sympathy? No. Narancia and Trish hadn't known each other well enough to give rise to emotions like that. They really didn't know each other at all. Narancia didn't have the emotional connection to Trish required to risk his life for her. Fugo was sure of it, but he had no idea why Bucciolati had wanted to save her enough to throw his life away either. Abacchio, he understood. Fugo knew the man felt guilty about his time as a corrupt cop. He'd more or less joined Passione looking for a place to sacrifice himself. He had no interest in protecting Trish. He simply latched onto what Bucciolati had said about this being the right thing to do. It didn't matter what that thing was. Mista was equally simple. He must have decided to go with Bucciolati instantly, perhaps hoping to get his hands on the boss's treasure or some such simple-minded ambition. The only reason he didn't jump on board right away was that this would have made him the fourth person on board. He waited for Abacchio, which made him the 5th. Mr.'s conviction that luck would always be on his side as long as he avoided the number 4 had long since passed beyond superstition into the basis of some private religion. There was no point in trying to understand. And Giorno... Fugo felt a chill run down his spine. If Fugo had made any mistakes back then, it was his assumption that Bucciolati was calling the shots, when in fact it had been Giorno all along. He should have tried to change that boy's mind, not Bucciolati's. Giorno Giovanna was determined to take down the boss and wrest control of his power. Bucciolati simply followed his lead.
Come to think of it, Giorno volunteered to take Trish to the boss. Abacchio objected and Bucciolati wound up taking her. Maybe we should have let Giorno go. If he'd managed to win, maybe none of this would have ever happened.
Perhaps Giorno would have let Trish die, sacrifice her for a clue to the boss's identity, allowing him to formulate a better, safer plan, one with less deaths on his side. He didn't exactly wish that was what had happened, but if it had, Fugo would never have left. If only Abacchio had kept his... No, there was no point dwelling on hypotheticals. Ultimately, all of them were just caught up in the battle between Giorno and Diavolo, like the battles in epics, 2 legends out to prove which of them was the true ruler. Whether they fled or it killed them, none of them were responsible. They were all victims.
What were you thinking, Narancia?
That question kept nagging at his heart like a fishbone stuck in his throat. He tried to convince himself he'd made the right call, that his choice had been the smart one. But he couldn't.
Narancia went with them. I couldn't.
That was the truth, and nothing would ever change that.
Why, Narancia? Trish is me? What were you feeling?
The helicopter flew on towards Syracuse. A Passione pilot was flying it. Marolo sat in the co-pilot seat. Sheila E. sat next to Fugo, her arms crossed, her silence stony. Fugo glanced over at her. She didn't talk much. She and Trish had that in common, at least.
If you...
he started.
What?
Sheila E. snapped, not even looking at him.
Well, if you suddenly found yourself with a bunch of strange men, how would you act?
Why do you ask?
Just wondering.
I don't know. Make sure they didn't mess with me?
Meaning?
Wouldn't give them the time of day.
She shrugged. Fugo blinked.
Was that why Trish had been so hostile? She was trying to maintain some degree of control, a desperate attempt to protect herself. She wasn't acting haughty because she was the boss's daughter, but because she was trying to keep herself safe. Still, remembering the way Trish had actually behaved, he couldn't feel any sympathy for her. Not wanting to be hurt was no excuse for hurting other people. He couldn't bring himself to cut her any slack. Is that because she'd hurt me?
The thought didn't sit well with him.
Did he really hate her because she'd effectively forced him to part with Bucciolati? Was he unconsciously out for payback, holding a grudge? He knew that this was hardly fair, but the more he thought about it, the more certain he was that those feelings were a part of him. With Fugo lost in thought, a silence settled on the cockpit again, a silence in which one barely registered the noise of the helicopter itself.
"Fugo," Sheila E. said, suddenly.
"Are you—"
She trailed off. Fugo glanced at her, but she seemed like she wasn't planning on finishing that thought. He didn't pry. Their silence seemed to make Marolo uncomfortable, and he started pestering the pilot with questions.
"Hey, pilot, aren't we flying too high? Drop us down a little, they'll see us."
"The higher you fly, the less people notice. We are too small to see from down below. You never done this before?"
"I don't care if we look big or small, they'll know which way we're headed."
"We go lower, we can't fly as fast. You're the one in a hurry."
"That's fine, it's still faster than a car or a train. Just do what I..."
He broke off. Staring at something past the pilot, outside the window, there was a little bird flying next to them, matching pace with the helicopter.
"How fast are we going?"
"Well, you said you were in a hurry, so I'm pushing her as hard as I can. This is a fast machine, and currently we are travelling at just a smidgen over 250 clicks.
"So, what's up with that bird?"
Marolo pointed out the window. It didn't even look like it was trying that hard to keep up. No normal bird would come close to a helicopter. The spinning blades tore up the air currents. But this bird didn't seem put out in the least, like it was flying on a calm day, and it was getting closer to them. Well, I think, said the pilot, but Murolo interrupted him with a shriek.
No, that's not a bird. It's an enemy stand.
By then, it was too late. The helicopter dropped like a stone towards the sea below. The girl, who could only survive on drugs, had unleashed all her pent-up, bottomless, unshakable fury on them.
Hello everyone, hope you enjoyed that episode. Quite a long episode, but what can I say? The chapters are getting a little bit longer since I'm just trying to finish up everything that I can in the shortest number of episodes possible. So things are going to be a bit tighter now, and there'll be a lot more episodes where I just finish an entire chapter in one go, as opposed to kind of the part 1, part 2 setup that I had for the earlier parts of the audiobook. So I hope you guys are enjoying the longer episodes. Let's get into our discussion of this episode. It started with a very dramatic reaction to Kokaki's death from the narcotics team. You know, the episode starts with Vittorio Cataldi just screaming and yelling, and I didn't feel the urge to scream and yell as much as he did, so I made it more of like a whimper. You know, this is where I lament the fact that I'm not actually an actor, and the fact that I have to act at all in these audiobooks, or in this audiobook, has made me kind of wary of ever doing an audiobook ever again, since it is very challenging. It is rather stressful to be, you know, to not be sure whether you've gotten the emotion right, or whether you just sound very silly. Listening to it back again, I think it kind of toes that line, which isn't really a good thing. You want the acting to be emotionally investing as opposed to something that other people will laugh at. You know, you don't want it to be a moment from the room, like the one where Tommy Wiseau walks in. He says, "I did not hit her! I did not! It's not true! I did not hit her!" Throws a water bottle. "I did not!" Right? Like, I don't want Vittorio Cataldi's grief to be parodied in that way. So yeah, it's quite stressful. And then I got to Angelica, and she's screaming and yelling, and God, there was a lot of screaming and yelling when you think about it, because later on Fugo is also screaming and yelling when he flashes back. So wow, yeah, forgive me for this episode is all I'm going to say, if you found the acting to be lackluster. But what can I say? I'm not an actor, I'm just a big fan of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. This audiobook wasn't meant to be a display of my skills, it was just meant to be something that I do to have fun. And maybe if I wanted to be as loose and wild and crazy and imaginative and not bound to the emotions of the characters, then maybe I should have done a George Joestar audiobook instead. But here I am with Purple Haze feedback, and things are getting pretty crazy. We've finally hit like what to me is the climax, like the end of this chapter. The Passione squad is attacked by Angelica, and this is the start, the beginning of the end, as it were. So yeah, things are finally getting heated up, and we're finally getting to the real emotional meat of the story, rather than just all the backstory and stuff that we've gotten so far, including this chapter, but we'll get to that soon enough, since there's something much more important to talk about, and that is the stone mask! The stone mask from parts 1 and 2 finally making an appearance in the JoJo storyline. Well, as much as Purple Haze feedback is part of the JoJo storyline. As much as I said in the previous episode that Purple Haze feedback was just tying into stuff from part 5 that we didn't care about, you know, these characters and these plot points that no one really asked questions about, the stone mask is actually something that readers would be invested in. It was a big plot point for parts 1 and 2, and to see it come back, to see some vestige of that, is something that the readers would say, "Oh, that's really cool, that changes a lot." Now we understand the stakes, now we see that the stakes have been raised, because if Massimo Volpe does get his hands on the stone mask, well, we get another Dio, effectively. Maybe he's not as immediately sadistic as Dio, but he's certainly, you know, with Kokaki's death, he's certainly driven enough to put on the stone mask and wreak havoc. Not just on Fugo's team, but as we saw from that scene in the warehouse, pretty much anyone who gets in their way, anyone who they do not agree with, and all of Passione effectively. But yeah, like I said, a very cool card to play. If you're a JoJo's Bizarre Adventure nerd, then I'm sure this will tickle your fancy. They even mentioned Stroheim, which is always a trump card. Which JoJo fan does not love Stroheim? And to have him mentioned, even briefly in Purple Haze feedback, is kind of like saying, hey, yeah, we're all fans, we're all in this together. And I love Stroheim just as much as you do. And I think that was a nice bone to throw, if I can put it that way, from the author. Let's move on to the next big part, and that's novelization of the scene where Fugo breaks away from Bruno's team. The last time we ever see Fugo in the manga.
It's this extended scene where Bruno is trying to tell his teammates to join him, and the rest of the gang say okay. Narancia is a bit less easy to convince, but somehow he convinces himself to get on the boat. Just ignore that happened, guys. I'm gonna pretend like it never happened. I urge you guys to do the same. Thank you. Narancia kind of convinces himself that Bruno is in the right and that they should be saving Trish. And Fugo doesn't get that one bit. He's like, why the heck are these people going with Bruno? And this little section of the chapter I actually kind of like, because we see this little scene from the focus of Fugo. Fugo, the only person who decides not to join Bruno, which I think it should have been from the start. You know, Fugo is the one who says, you're doing the wrong thing, guys. But Bruno is absolutely convinced that he is doing the right thing, even if he will now face the wrath of the boss. And this whole segment, I think, kind of puts words into Fugo's mouth, in that Fugo says one thing in the manga, but the author, instead of sticking to those words, kind of puts a little bit of a twist on it, in that Fugo doesn't actually believe the words he's saying. He's more just trying to humor Bucciolati in order to get him on Fugo's side of the argument, right? Because ultimately he wants Bucciolati to not go against the boss. And I actually kind of like that. I think it gives Fugo a bit more depth, which is obvious. I mean, the whole point of that entire conflict was that Fugo would be written out of the story. It would make very little sense if Araki decided to give Fugo depth just before he got written out. But by giving him this split between what he says and what he thinks, it's just a very simple way of giving him a little bit of a character and a personality. And in this way, it's not just like him being completely written out of the story. He's actually got his own problems to solve, and that's what Purple Haze feedback is all about. So in this case, I can empathize with the author in changing the source material. To me, it's not as sinful as the author just completely changing Giorno's motivations regarding drugs. And I actually kind of like it in that regard. I think it's fair. On the other hand, we also lose a lot of characterization of Abbacchio, of Mista. We get simplifications of their characters and their motivations, right? Like, Abbacchio is said to be just following Bruno almost blindly. Like, he doesn't even care about Trish or saving her. It's just that this is the morally right thing to do according to Bucciolati, and Abbacchio believes that. That's kind of how I read that little statement there. And then Mista doesn't even have like a turning point. He just always felt like he should join Bucciolati. It was just the number 4 thing, which again is a pretty drastic simplification. And then Bruno himself is simplified as well, because according to Purple Haze feedback, he's just following Giorno again. And well, I'm not going to rant about it again after all the talking I did about it in the previous video. You know, if you've seen that video, you guys know my stance on that. So let's just move on. There is a bit of a weird interaction between Sheila E and Fugo on the helicopter that they get on, where Fugo kind of says, hey, if you were surrounded by a bunch of guys who were trying to protect you, how would you act? And Sheila E says, well, I wouldn't. This is what the translation is. I'm going to read it right out. I would make sure, right, this is how it goes, make sure they didn't fuck with me. I don't know how to approach that. Like, does she mean that literally, or does she mean that, is that just like a translation thing where the translator kind of just made it sound a lot harsher than it actually is? And I didn't know, so I said, make sure they didn't mess with me, which has the connotation of the literal sense of fuck with me, and then the literal sense of the connotation of fuck, if that made any sense at all. So if someone has like a Japanese copy, then I'd be interested to know what she actually said there, because this is one of those things that I was like, hang on, wait a minute, she doesn't actually mean that literally, does she? But if that is the case, then it would be kind of interesting to think that Trish just didn't want to have sex with any of the other guys when they're all like 15, 16, like between 15 and 20. I mean, I don't know, it just seems like such an awkward thought. And I doubt Araki had that intention in mind. I think Trish was meant to genuinely be kind of considered a spoilt character, and Fugo was justified in not liking her. And all this stuff about, oh, I actually hated her because she took Bucciolati away from me. That does work into kind of the very homosexual undertones that JoJo has within it, but in this case, I think it's pushing it a little bit too far. And so that's the end of this episode. Gosh, I'm at 18 minutes. This is going to be a really, really long video unless I cut a bunch of stuff out. And so with that out of the way, let's wrap up this video. Thank you guys very much for listening as usual. If you guys enjoyed it, be sure to leave a like, comment your thoughts and your feedback below, and I'll be sure to read them and reply to them as always. And if you're excited for more Purple Haze feedback, then be sure to subscribe, as more videos are certainly on the way. And so, until the next video.